Roll up, step right this way, ladies and gentlemen. On the other side of these canvas doors, you're about to witness something so monstrous, so hideous, so repulsive, that it will turn your stomachs and fill you with amazement. The creature you'll find in this tent has been known to elicit all manner of responses from well-to-do folks like yourselves. You may want to laugh at it, you may want to strike it down, you may even want to throw rotten fruit at it. And believe you me, we are prepared for that. You will find all manner of rotten tomatoes, eggs, and other festering foods that are begging to be pelted for the low price of 5 cents per handful. If you follow me through these doors and gather around this cage quietly, perhaps you will see it. Wait for your eyes to adjust to the dark and hold your revulsion until you cannot bear it anymore. Only then will we get to look at the papery gray skin sagging loose over a swollen gut. Marvel at its tree-trunk legs, barely strong enough to support its own weight, its deformed trunk that hangs limp off the front of its face, and its ridiculous ears that flap nervously when it's afraid. Don't be afraid of the tusks sticking out from its face or its cries of pain and anguish. Instead, hold your tongues and wait. For if you're patient enough, and perhaps with a slight beating, it may even play us a song with the valves on its trunk. Then, and only then, you're permitted to pelt the Elephant Man with whatever you see fit, as you bask in the glory of Herman Fuller's Circus of the Disquieting. Reese Freeman didn't have much of a choice but to join the circus at the age of 14. The cast-out son of a freed slave in New Orleans, he spent much of his early life wandering the streets, trying not to get into any trouble. In the late 1800s, very few places were interested in hiring a young black man, unless, of course, they were looking to turn him back to the life that his father had fought so hard to escape. That's why when Reese was out fishing one afternoon and saw a big red tent going up on the outskirts of town, he couldn't help but wander over. Much to his surprise, a group of black men were the ones raising the marquee. They didn't look like slaves either. Reese had never heard of a circus. The closest he'd ever come to seeing was a traveling entertainment cart that would sometimes pop up around town with a dancing bear in a cage, or a glass ball and a pack of tarot cards. The brightly colored tents that went up one after another were enough to draw a crowd. Even the most well-respected in New Orleans came out for a look. Standing ankle-deep in the river, Reese peered over at the man who came out to address the throng. Dressed in a long tailcoat with a tall top hat, the man stood on a box of fruit and waved a cane dramatically in the air. Good folks of New Orleans! What you're about to witness tonight has never before been seen this side of the Mississippi. Wonders and amazement galore, spectacle and intrigue, mystery and mayhem, and just a touch of the impossible. I go by the name of Herman Fuller, the most talented and notorious circus master in the entire United States. The dazzling array of shows that I've brought before you is not for the faint of heart or the weak of constitution. Your stomachs will be turned and your minds may be altered, but it promises to be a night that you will never forget. Reese wasn't much interested in any of what he had just said. This kind of two-penny show was reserved for the folks who had the money to throw around on needless things like smiling and having a nice evening. What Reese was far more interested in were the groups of men working behind the scenes, pulling various carts and setting up all of the stalls. A lot of them didn't look much older than him. A grin spread across his face. SCP-4409 insisted on being interviewed in the dark. With all the lights in the interview chamber switched off, Dr. Simon Crossley entered the room and sat down across from the Elephant Man. Even in the dim light, though, he was able to still make out part of the man's features: the ivory tusks, the hanging nose, and the nervously twitching ears. The man had been picked up in St. Louis, where local police had found him panhandling in the streets. While he certainly seemed harmless enough, it was important for the Foundation to take him in just to be sure. Sitting in the dark interview room, Reese Freeman was apprehensive at first about telling his side of the story. A life of being mocked, spat on, and chased out of towns had left him with a real distrust of other people. That was probably made worse by his apprehension at being put in another cage within the Foundation. He told Dr. Crossley that he was born as normal as could be, that his current ghastly affliction was something done to him quite some time ago. But as much as it pained him to recollect, it was a tale that he knew he'd probably have to tell. Dr. Crossley replied that he was all ears. It took Dr. Crossley a few seconds to realize his faux pas. SCP-4409 glared at him before continuing to explain how he was made the way he was. Reese Freeman had managed to land a job with the circus surprisingly easily, despite having no previous experience and no references to back him up. Herman Fuller took a shine to him. It was menial work, and not many folks were up to doing it, but since Reese had never had a job before, he didn't know any better. He started out at the bottom of the ladder, scraping out feces, washing down old cages, and carrying heavy crates. The once scrawny 14-year-old boy quickly turned into a stocky 17-year-old with broad shoulders and strong legs. They would travel from town to town across most of the United States, stopping off in major cities for weeks at a time to bring in as much money as possible before moving on. Reese didn't save much of that money, but he didn't mind. The fact that he got 2 meals a day and something to do with himself was enough. In fact, he kind of enjoyed sleeping on top of the carts as the horses pulled them across the dusty American roads. The one thing that always seemed to affect him, though, was that he was never allowed to actually see inside the tents. He would see folks come and go through the canvas doors week after week, but was never allowed so much as a peek inside himself. The older guys were responsible for throwing the canvas sheets over the cages, which would remain that way as they traveled. Not having seen much of the world at that point, Reese didn't have much of an idea of what could be in those cages. Perhaps some kind of animal from a foreign country, something from Africa or Asia. They made all kinds of noise. Reese said that most of them sounded like humans, but then they'd go and make strange animal sounds that no human mouth could ever produce. One night, his curiosity got the better of him. Hanging back before the crowds got into the tent, he sidestepped over to the entrance, making sure that no one saw him, and took a peek through the doorway. It was dark inside, too dark to make out much of what was happening. The crowd of people was standing between him and the cage, all jostling and leaning this way and that, trying to make out whatever it was that was inside. A screeching sound filled the air, making the whole crowd and Reese outside jump right. Standing on his tiptoes, he tried his best to see what was moving around in that cage. It seemed to be moving around like a person, lurching this way and that, but the sounds coming from it sounded more like a bird. And sure enough, after a moment, a huge pair of disproportionately ugly wings stretched out from either side of the creature, flapping and sending a rush of air through the tent so powerful that it blew the flap wide open in front of him just as Herman Fuller turned around to see him standing there. Reese bolted and hid behind one of the carts. He was going to be in trouble for this. He was sure of it. It was one of Fuller's only rules of the circus, and he had just gone and broken it. He was in the hottest water imaginable. But as nighttime fell and the dregs of the spectators wandered out of the tent, Fuller seemed to be in too bad a mood at all. Watching him from a distance, Reese got the impression that he might not actually be in as much trouble as he thought. Fuller caught his eye and came over, cane twirling and top hat sitting jauntily atop his head. Reese got off on the wrong foot, apologizing right away for spying into the tent. The circus master just laughed it off and slapped him on the back. "Reese, my boy, don't worry about it. I've got much bigger plans for you. Much, much bigger." That night, as Reese lay in bed, he had a terrible dream about what he had seen in the tent that day. Circus of the Disquieting was certainly an apt title for this place. The image of that strange, shadowy bird person in the cage haunted his nightmares until suddenly, 2 pairs of strong hands gripped him and ripped him out of his sleep. He knew better than to fight back. This was surely going to be his comeuppance for breaking Fuller's rules earlier. They dragged him into the main tent where there was an oil lamp in the middle, illuminating what looked like a heavy wooden operating table. His wrists and ankles were strapped in, and then the 2 men left him alone. He had half a mind to scream, but with all the caged-up creatures from the circus around him, he doubted anyone would pay him much mind. It was almost an hour before Herman Fuller walked into the tent. By this point, Reese expected him to be walking in with surgical equipment, gloves, maybe even a saw, but the man had nothing in his bare hands. Herman Fuller asked him if he ever heard of Joseph Merrick. Reese didn't answer. Of course he'd heard of the Elephant Man. The whole world had been talking about Joseph Merrick for months. A man born so hideously deformed that people had compared him to an elephant, though the resemblance wasn't that convincing. This sentiment was clearly shared by Fuller, who placed one hand on either side of Reese's face and began to softly massage his cheeks, explaining how disappointed he was that Merrick didn't actually look all that much like an elephant. Reese's cheeks started to hurt as the man massaged him, almost as if he was stretching and pulling at his face, finding loose skin. The boy asked Fuller what he was doing. The circus master just smiled at him and explained that it was an old technique handed down in his family. A gift, he called it. He started touching Reese's nose, gently pulling at it with more and more pressure. Much to Reese's surprise, he felt his nose elongating, growing longer and longer in the man's hand. He tried to twitch his face and was starting to find that his new nose twitched along with it. The longer it grew, the more painful it felt, the skin and flesh from his head being ripped and pulled into a new shape. At several points, Reese felt ready to pass out from the agony, but the circus master kept talking to him, kept him awake through the whole ordeal as he molded the boy's face like clay into the shape of an elephant. Lying on the bench panting, Reese could see his trunk from between his two eyes. It was a nightmare. That was all it was. But then Fuller reached under the workbench and lifted out a small hand drill. One by one, he punched holes into the top of Reese's trunk, installing little valves like a trumpet as he went. Standing back to admire his handiwork, he told Reese that he would be his new favorite attraction. "My boy, I have made you into a star." The tusks did not come straight away. Over the course of several months, they slowly and painfully emerged from his deformed jaw. His elephantine legs were also not part of his initial transformation, but instead came as a result of health issues he developed while being trapped in a cage for several decades. Crowds of people would come and go, flocking to see the Elephant Man. Having spent the first part of his life constantly hungry, Reese was now being overfed every day. Hands would come to his cage and force him to eat rich, fatty foods, denying him any possibility of exercise. The broad shoulders and strong legs that he had developed while working at the circus melted away under layers and layers of fat. His skin went gray and papery, folding and wrinkling in on itself, either from Fuller's magic or just from a lack of sunlight. Whatever it was, with every passing day, Reese Freeman steadily became more and more hideous. SCP-4409 was stuck in the circus for much of his life. Eventually, Herman Fuller moved on and is currently being hunted by the SCP Foundation. When he did, SCP-4409 was able to bargain for its freedom from the circus. Wandering from city to city, never sticking around for very long, SCP-4409 begged for change at the side of the road. Some people would feel sympathy, while most would feel horror at its disfigurement. From its years trapped in a cage, SCP-4409 has developed severe health issues, including gout, severe obesity, and metabolic syndrome. While in Foundation custody, it is fed a special diet to counteract these conditions. As of yet, the Foundation has no way of reversing what was done to Reese Freeman in the tent in the 1800s. As Reese poses no threat to the Foundation, he is allowed to live with relative freedom, or at least as much freedom as a contained SCP can earn. His health condition severely limits his mobility around Site-66, a low-security residential containment area. Unable to walk even moderate distances, SCP-4409 heavily relies on the use of a cane and a heavy-duty walker, capable of supporting up to 140 kilograms. Researchers listen intently at his door, waiting to hear if he's ever going to play a sad song on his trumpet, but no sound ever emerges, except for his heavy breathing and spluttering coughs. It appears that having spent decades locked in a small cage, a sedentary life is all he knows now. With every opportunity to exercise, read books, and take up new hobbies, SCP-4409 appears unable to engage with anything other than sitting and staring at the same spot on the wall every day. If an animal has spent its whole life living in a zoo and finds in its old age that one of the walls has fallen down, what use has it in taking a step outside? Now check out SCP-082 Ferdinand the Cannibal and SCP-5031 Yet Another Murder Monster.